Metadata. I clearly have a love-hate relationship with metadata when it comes to questioned digital document examination. On the one hand, metadata seems to be so valuable. It provides us with all those exciting details. It tells us when the document was written. It tells us, in many cases, by whom. It tells us at what organization it was written. Sometimes it tells us how long the person worked on that document, and the list goes on and on and on. Obviously, not all documents include such rich lists of metadata, but most of them include pretty useful items. Those are things that we'd love to know when we are examining a question document. But the question is, do we know it? Because metadata can be changed so easily. It usually doesn't take an expert to change the metadata, and it can be changed to say anything. Maybe we should not even look at metadata at all, because it is so unreliable. And that's the whole point that we're going to ask in this video, that we're going to explore in this video, whether metadata has a role at all in the examination of questioned digital documents. Let's start our story with events that happened in 2002. Those were never, as far as I know, the subject of any forensic examination. It was never part of any criminal or civil court matter. It was simply a matter of political interest and the consequences of political decisions. Events that I'm talking about, or the specific event that I'm talking about, is a document that was authored allegedly by the President of South Africa, President Thabo Mbeki. Now, whether he wrote it or not, I don't think anyone knows to this day. I obtained a copy of that document. The title of the document was Castro Clonwane, Caravans, Cats, Geese, Foot and Mouth, and Statistics. And the subtitle was HIV/AIDS and the Struggle for the Humanization of the African. The copy that I obtained from somewhere on the internet. It was in a word processor format that was popular at the time. I opened it up in that word processor. I looked at the metadata, the about information for the document, and I could see information there that clearly suggested that the president was, at the very least, involved in the writing of this document. But I knew that I could change that information using that very same word processor to anything else I wanted to. So was this someone who wanted the document to be attributed to the president who filled in that metadata, or was it authentic? There was no way for me to tell, and I had to dismiss it. It meant nothing. And therefore, as I said, up to this day, I have no idea whether the president wrote it or not. We all know that it expressed his opinions, he said that, but whether he was the author, it's an open question. And that clearly explains the problem that we have when we look at such metadata. If it provides us with something so potentially useful, but we just can't trust it, what is the point of even looking at it? Let's try a little experiment. And what we're going to do in this experiment is we are going to take metadata and we are going to change it, and then we're going to see what the outcomes are. We're going to say, is it really so easy to change metadata? Or is there something else that happens, and maybe changing metadata is not so easy after all, at least in some cases. So for the purposes of illustration, Let's assume that I'm accused of doing something bad in South Africa at a given time. I didn't do it, hopefully not, but I have an alibi and I want to prove that I wasn't even in South Africa at that time. And this alibi is in the form of pictures. And as you can see, those pictures, some of them with me on them, and the others taken by me, were clearly not taken in South Africa. So if these pictures were taken while this bad thing happened, this crime was committed or whatever, then I have a pretty solid proof that I wasn't in the country, and I can submit this proof and I cannot be found guilty. At least that's what I'm hoping at this moment. Let's make those changes and then see what happens. So there are the pictures in my album. Normally, if you are a forger, you would want to get rid of the originals and just keep the forged ones. However, I deem this to be an educational exercise, and therefore I'm going to keep the original, and I'm just going to create a copy of Pic1 that I'm calling Alibi. With Alibi visible, I can now begin to look at its properties. And in the properties, I see the various entries. Those are typical file entries, so I'm not particularly interested in those. I'm more interested in the details. And here you can see the date on which the picture was actually taken. You can see some details about the camera that was used, and then information about the resolution, more information about the shot, some advanced information, and there is also what I like. It's the GPS coordinates of where I was, or maybe where I will be. Let's change this and let's look at the date there. There's the date, and there's nothing that prevents me from changing that date to the date for which I want an alibi. And let's say I want it for 1st of January 2021. And it's updated. I just want to look at it in a bit more detail, so let's just say there, and there you can see my alibi, and you can see picture 1, picture 2, picture 3, picture 4. There's a slight concern. If I want to use this picture as an alibi for 2021, and it's on my computer with a date of 2020, that's probably not a good idea. So I have to change the file date and time and so on. So what I can do is I can say change the date for me to, what was it, the 1st of January 2021, and let's say 1807. Well, I want to make it 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I want to do that to my alibi. And let's just look at what I have now, and there is my alibi, and yes, it's taken in 2021, which is in the future from where I am now, and it is 3 o'clock. So this seems like a really great piece of work that I've done here. I just have to change the others so that they also indicate my location in some future universe. However, you've seen the properties that I've looked at a moment or two ago in Windows Explorer. But what I want to do next is I want to run Exif Tool on it. The Exif Tool is just a tool that shows me the Exif data, in other words, the metadata in a picture. Also in some other files, but let's start with a picture. And there's the alibi, and I'm just going to let it run. And that was a bit quick, so you probably didn't see all of it going past. But even here on this very last screen, and we'll return to the earlier screens in a moment or two, you can see that I have a GPS date and time in my metadata. And the GPS date and time says that this picture was taken on the 1st of January 2020. And it was taken at 12:53:40 Zulu, so universal time. It's not quite what I had hoped for. I had hoped that I've changed the date of this picture. Again, you can see that's where I was, or will be, depending on how you look at this. So let's just look at the data slightly slower. And you can see that's just the tool number, that's the name that I've now given it. Those are the dates there. You can see the file date has been modified, but my access and my creation dates have not been modified yet. So I need to be slightly cleverer than I thought I was to also change that. Going on, all sorts of interesting information. There you can see the Pentax K1 is the camera that was used to take it. And there's a modification date. Yet again, it's not what I had hoped for. What else do we see here? Date 2020. It's not what I'd hoped for. Interesting. Now, this is just user input, but my hometown city is entered as Johannesburg, and for some reason that's the destination city that I've entered on my camera. Here we've got something interesting. I have binary data. It's a thumbnail of the picture. So if I were to change the picture, I can keep the old thumbnail or whatever. One of those games that I sometimes play with students in exams, I change the thumbnail, and then when they click on it, they get a totally different picture. All sorts of other information. Let's just see what happened to that date that I entered. And all sorts of dates. But there you can see that I've in fact changed the create date and the original date. But just look at all these other dates. There's the manufacturing date of my camera. There's another date. I've changed the obvious date, but that's the only thing that I've changed. While we are playing with this tool, I didn't have time to look at all the information provided, but what I can also do, this is my alibi picture, I can ask for the serial, and there you see my camera serial number. So that ties this picture pretty specifically to me. If you look at the serial number, if you analyze it a little bit, you'll figure out that this is one of a few special edition cameras, only 2,000 manufactured. So not too hard to perhaps go to the place sales record and see if you can trace that serial number to me. But more important than what we've just learned is the following. If I get the Exif data out of the original, so there's the Exif tool, and the original was Pic3, and I'm just going to redirect that to exif1.txt. And then the one that I've just created, the one that I've played with, is the alibi. And I'm sending that to Exif 2. Now I want to see what the differences are between these two Exif data sets that I've created, Exif 1 and Exif 2. Quite a couple of differences. So let's output this or pipe this through less. So what we see here is that in the one version, in the one case we use that version of the Exif tool, in the other case we use that version. No big deal. We know that the file names change, so no big deal there. Here, if I look at the file modification time, it is 2020. That was for the original picture. For the copied picture, I've changed the time of the file. So there is a different file time. Now we get to the interesting stuff. If you look at the original file, it was encoded as Little Endian byte order. However, in the new one, it is encoded as Big Endian. I didn't want that to change. I just wanted to change the date. Looks good because here is the changed date, indeed, the create date and the original date, 2021, where it used to be 2020. Great, I'm glad about that change. Then here we have an entry, autofocus point special, and we have a flash pics version, which is the same in the new one, but suddenly we have two new Exif entries that we didn't have previously. So it also added entries, whatever they mean, that's not really important. Now it gets a little bit blurry because we've got the original data on the first screen here, and you can see that there's some Exif data, image height and interoperability index, and there is in the new one an Exif image height and an interoperability version. No index, no interoperability index. Here again in the original I had two entries. They appear in the copy as well, but I've got a new entry that wasn't there. The bottom line is that we have removed and added entries to the Exif data, and we've also changed some of the encoding by simply changing the date. That is not good. That means if I know what to expect from a Pentax K1 in terms of Exif data, then I can see that what I'm getting here does not match my expectations, because some Exif entries are not there and some have been added. We still have to look at the file sizes. One of the interesting things here is that my original picture was 17 megabytes in size, and if you look at the lower part there, you can see that this was the size. The copy that I've made and then just changed the date is suddenly significantly larger than what it used to be. Pic 1 and Pic 2 were in the same order, so we would expect that. Why was Pic 3 smaller? Well, Pic 3 was taken with only a part of the sensor. For the photography enthusiasts, the Pentax K1 is a full-frame camera, and there I used in an APS mode, so I used a fraction of the sensor, and I therefore got a smaller picture. This final picture, Pic 4, was taken on a cell phone, and that is why it is so much smaller. If we want to look at its data, then we can run Exif Tool, and we can run it on Pic 4, and you will see that we're getting the same sort of information. One of the interesting things here, again, if you're into photography at all, is how the short lenses on the cell phone translate into 35mm equivalents. But that's not important for our purposes. What we've done here, and that's the important thing, is by changing the date using Windows Explorer, we have caused significant side effects. We have increased the size of the file, something that we would not necessarily notice, but we've added additional Exif entries that were not there. We've removed some Exif entries that were there in the original. We've not changed all the data because a lot of the date of the entries still point to 2020. So that change via Windows Explorer was not sufficient for the changes that we made. That doesn't mean that a perfect forgery cannot be made. Someone who has the knowledge may use an appropriate tool, and Vim is arguably not the best tool. I would prefer to use a hex editor, but it's good enough for illustration here. And if we were to look at pic1.jpg, that's the picture in which I changed the date, that's the original without the changed date, then we can see in this binary file that there is an Exif marker, and we can see all the various bits and pieces of Exif data that we encountered somewhere. In particular, all these dates are here, and we would be able to change all of them. One question is, in a JPEG file, is there a checksum? Because if there's a checksum, then I'll also have to recompute that. So this requires quite a bit of skill. I need to know where all the time fields are. I need to be able to change all of them, and perhaps I have to change some other things as well. One of the examples that I may have to change is the following. Let us use Exif Tool once more. I'm going to use it on my alibi picture, and I'm just going to search for the word shutter. And we'll get all sorts of interesting information, but in particular, that picture was the 1933rd picture that was taken with my camera. So if the police were to seize my camera and they were to see that this is totally out of sync with where that camera's shutter count is now, never mind the future, I am in trouble once again. So you can see how interdependent these values are. It is really hard to get everything to add up, everything to be synchronized. In a nutshell, we need a true expert who would be able to change all the metadata in this entry to be consistent. That is pretty hard to do. Now, we are not psychologists, so we cannot really say who is and who is not able to make such changes. But it seems like common sense that the average person will not be able to make these changes. In other words, someone who is not familiar with bits and bytes and hexadecimal and Exif encoding and so on. It is a sort of knowledge that one acquires through a lot of work. However, in our report, we can simply indicate the amount of effort that would be required, the type of knowledge that would be required to make this perfect forgery. It's up to the court to decide whether the person who stands accused is indeed able to have made a perfect forgery. The logical consequence of what we've been doing in this example is the following. If we can build a database for either all cameras or at the very least the most popular cameras, in which we can somehow indicate the expected Exif data, then it means we have something against which we can compare Exif data in a particular image. And if the two don't match, then it means that that particular picture did not come straight from that camera. It's a lot of work to build that database, but it's a lot of work to collect millions of fingerprints from people as well, so we should not shy away from that sort of work. Just as an aside, note that Exif Tool is not a tested forensic tool. It is a tool that is widely used. It is used not only for Exif data, but also for other purposes. So I do trust it to a large extent, but it is not at a level where one can trust it to take this evidence to court. One option is to use it as a tool for obtaining information and then disassembling the information that we find in the file until we have isolated the evidence that clearly demonstrates the modifications that have been made. The other alternative is to subject Exif Tool to testing so that it is deemed to be a forensic tool. There are also other tools that may do the same work, and one of them may also be used. It doesn't have to be Exif Tool. In this illustration, we've seen that changing the date affects other parts of the document. Now, this will not be true for all documents, and we have to extend our analysis to determine how other documents are affected by such changes. In this particular case, we have used the so-called Exif data, and we have changed Exif, and chances are that other documents will be affected in the same way. Now, if we're talking about forensic science, then I shouldn't use chances are or any expressions like that. I should be certain, I should be very sure of my claim that I'm making. So this clearly needs further analysis. We need experimentation and so on. But I'm pretty hopeful that we will be able to show that I am correct. This raises another point. If we see that a document has been changed in a certain way, so I know that this is no longer the picture that was produced by that particular Pentax camera, can I begin to answer questions about who made those changes? Can I in any way attribute the changes to anyone? That's a really good question, because so often we will have a criminal matter and there will be a forged document, and we don't necessarily want to know who did not do it. We want to know who did it. We'll get back to that point. I've just said in a criminal matter, also in a civil matter, the same question is relevant. But before we answer that question, let's return to Exif as an example. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at the things that Wikipedia complains about when it discusses Exif. Again, chances are that if I say I got my forensic information from Wikipedia, that the court will laugh at me. So, yet again, we need to go further than that. But what we see in this Wikipedia entry is that it talks about problems that exist in Exif files, and that gives us a rather good starting point to explore whether those problems do occur in reality. And who knows, we may even be able to say that this problem occurs when you change the file using that tool. And that begins to answer the question that I posed a moment or two ago a little bit, only a tiny bit. But let's go to Wikipedia, look at its complaints, and then see how that helps us to talk about questioned digital documents. The point is not that this is an exhaustive list of problems. These are issues that were raised on Wikipedia chances are that when you look at Wikipedia after watching the video, the list may already have changed. My intention is to get a flavor of the problems because there is a lesson in that. I'm going to go through these points rather quickly, so if you want to read the details, pause the video. I just want to raise the highlighted points. Firstly, Exif has a rather interesting structure. It uses pointers to connect the various fields, and an editor that is not aware of all the pointers or all the entries that are linked by such pointers may corrupt the file when edited. That is great news for an examiner because we want to see such changes because we can learn that the file has indeed been modified from such corruption or such inadvertent changes. The standard defines a MakerNote tag where proprietary information is encoded. That proprietary information is encoded according to the manufacturer of the device that captures the image, so there's no way of universally rendering or understanding that field. If editing tools do not know how a specific field is encoded, it cannot modify that particular field, and it may either retain it as is or it may omit it. Again, great news for examiners. Exif is often used for scanners. We will see a note that contradicts this point slightly in a moment or two, but what it means is for any scanned images, the Exif data has to be encoded in some non-standard way. And yet again, if it's encoded in some non-standard way, then editing will probably cause changes that are unintended. Great news for examiners yet again. Exif makes provision for an embedded thumbnail. Editing the image itself may leave the thumbnail unmodified, and when one sees inconsistencies between the thumbnail and the image, then one knows that the image has been changed. Again, good news for examiners. The size restrictions in Jpeg images means that information that a camera manufacturer wants to record as metadata often cannot fit into the space available, and therefore the camera makers, the camera manufacturers have to find a workaround to store that information. Workarounds means that all editors will not be familiar with the workaround, and yet again we may find inconsistencies after editing the image. Yet again, great news for forensic document examiners. Time zone information was not recordable in Exif data prior to July 2016. What this means is that if you see any time zone information in Exif that predates July 2016, that time zone information could not have been present when the content was created. Again, great news for a forensic examiner who wants to know whether content has been changed. Many devices that record Exif data have a host of sensors, and Exif makes no provision for storage of all of that sensor information. In many cases, workarounds are used, and you may be able to see the data that is present as it has been derived from the sensor in the device rather than from the field for which the data was originally intended. That may lead you to confirm that the device could have been used to create the content. It also begs the question that we've seen so often: if an editor were to modify such information and it encounters partial information, let's say it encounters GPS information that does not have coordinates but does have other GPS tags included, how will the editor deal with that? It may deal with it in a way that may yet again reveal to us that the content has been modified. The DPI information, dots per inch information, is something that makes sense for scanners but not for cameras. So on the one hand, cameras may have to include some random value for the DPI field. If you find any randomness in what they include there, then we may be able to confirm that the DPI value that's been inserted by a camera is indeed associated with the value that the camera inserts in that field. On the other hand, on a scanner, if the DPI information and the resolution of the image imply that the image was too big to have been scanned on that scanner, we may again question whether that image does indeed come from that scanner. The bottom line is that there are so many things that can go wrong during editing of Exif content. That means that we are likely to encounter one or more of those problems whenever an Exif image is modified. And as we've said previously, such inconsistencies, in particular inconsistencies with what we expected and with what we encounter, or internal inconsistencies, may lead us to conclude that the content described by the Exif data has indeed been modified. It is indeed easy to edit metadata, but as we've just seen from Exif, there is a list of problems that make such editing hard and that may help us as forensic examiners. At the moment, you can see a list of tools that can edit metadata scrolling across the screen. This list is yet again from Wikipedia, and yet again the intention is not to consider it as an exhaustive or an authoritative list. The idea is to give an indication of the variety of editors. The idea is also to highlight various categories of metadata, various structures that are commonly used. We will display that list again briefly just before we start our discussion of the next structure that we are interested in. And as you will see, the structure that we are interested in is not even in that list, even though it is discussed in the table. The metadata structure that we want to look at next is Id3, or so-called Id3 Tags. Id3 is used primarily in music files. More specifically, one encounters it in almost every MP3 file, but its use is not limited to MP3 or even to music files. Id3 was initially developed as an ad hoc extension for MP3 files. At the end of the MP3 file, 128 bytes were added, and the 128 bytes were used to encode information such as the title, the artist, and the album title. The information was appended to the file, so any old MP3 player will still be able to play the file, but when it got to these very last bytes, at the worst, it could cause a little bit of a hissing sound, but not much because it's only 128 characters. So this was fully compliant with earlier MP3 players. You can see that the marker that was used to introduce this information was called tag, and then the title, the artist, the album were each allowed 30 characters. The year was a 4-character value. There was a 30-character comment field and a 1-byte genre field. It later on, as things developed, became known as Id3 version 1 because it preceded the others. It was not published or originally thought of as version 1. The very first extension that also later on got the name Id3 version 1.1 because it was such a simple extension of Id3 version 1 is one that said the 30-byte comment field is hardly ever used and the track number would be really useful. So what this standard, if we can call it a standard in quotes, did was it reduced the comment field to 28 characters. Then the 29th character was forced to be binary 0, so 000 in binary, and the final byte of the earlier comment field was used to indicate the track number. So still fully compliant even with Id3 version 1, and also fully compliant with MP3 players that were unaware of these Id3 tags that were appended to the file. One of the challenges faced by the Id3 version 1 standard was the fact that 30 characters for a title and an artist and an album wasn't really enough. For popular songs, a 30 character title may be fine, but just think of classical music. The extension that followed Id3 version 1.1 was known as the enhanced tag. And as you can see, the enhanced tag was indicated by starting the block with tag plus, and then it made provision for 60 characters in the title, 60 in the artist, 60 in the album, and so on. Now, this enhanced tag wanted to be compliant with Id3 version 1, so the idea was that you would put this data structure at the end of the MP3 file, and then after that, you would put the normal Id3 version 1 tag. So that gave you the same compatibility with earlier devices that didn't know about any of this, but it also gave you the compatibility with Id3 version 1 editors and music players, because they would just read the Id3 version 1 at the end of the file. Obviously, this caused the potential for duplicate information, because now you had a title of 60 characters in the enhanced tag, but you also had artist info of 30 characters in the Id3 version 1 protocol. So if you used a tool that would edit the artist in Id3 version 1, it wouldn't touch the enhanced tag, and then you would have data that is inconsistent. And that's exactly the type of inconsistency that we found so useful in Exif. Slightly more officially, Id3 version 1.1 was followed by Id3 version 1.2. The strategy was the same as with the enhanced tag. So you would have your music file, or whatever else you had in that MP3 file. Then you would append this new header that started with the word ext to indicate that it was extended, and then it gave you an additional 30 characters for the title, an additional 30 characters for the artist, an additional 30 characters for the album name. It extended the comment field by 15 bytes, and then it included a text field of 20 bytes that indicated the subgenre. And this was supposed to be followed by the Id3 data structure. So the Id3, whether it was Id3 version 1 or Id3 version 1.1, didn't really matter. But what you had then was that any player that didn't know about any of this would just ignore it all. Any player that knew about Id3 version 1.1 would go to the very end of the file and read the last 128 bytes, and it would get the Id3 version 1 or version 1.1 information. However, anything that was aware of Id3 version 1.2 would read the last 128 bytes and then also the 128 bytes that preceded that. And if it saw this extended header, then it knew that the title was extended. So what this meant was that the first 30 characters of the title would be at the end of the file in the Id3 tag. If that title exceeded 30 characters, it would run over to this new Id3 version 1.2 extension, and the remainder of the title would be in this particular data structure. The same with the artist. First 30 characters would be in the plain old Id3 version 1 tag, but if 30 bytes weren't enough, then it would be extended into the Id3 version 1.2 additional header or footer that was added. This is somewhat unorthodox to have the first 30 bytes at the end of the file and then the extension slightly before that, but it was fine. Problem, of course, was if you edited your file with something that only knew about Id3 version 1 or 1.1 and was unaware of Id3 version 1.2, then it would fit titles into the 30 character field at the end of the file, and it would not touch the Id3 version 1.2 extension. So you may have remnants of the song or of the artist name or of the album name in this extended header that your editor was not aware of. And yet again, this is excellent if you want to examine a file to see whether it was edited. Id3 version 2 works totally differently. So it's got the same name as the Id3 version 1 structures, but this is an entirely different construction. The way it works is that the Id3 version 2 information is placed into frames, and those frames are put into the header of the MP3 file. And you can have multiple frames, and those frames can be rather large, up to 16 megabytes in length. If it's just a song, then it can be a very short title. But if it is a picture of the album, or of the conductor, or of the artist, or of the orchestra, or all of the above, then all of those can be added as frames and embedded into the MP3 file. You can see that the work around Id3 version 2 was quite active in 1998, 1999, and 2000. The earlier version, Id3 version 2.0, Id3 version 2.1, were not really available to the public, so it's uncommon to see them. You really don't have to take note of them. A couple of the differences that we saw evolving over time was that initially provision was made for text to be stored in Latin, in other words, the plain 7-bit ASCII character set, and also in Unicode as universal character set, 16-byte encoding. Later on, that was extended to include UTF-16, and in the last version that was published to date, UCS2 was dropped and UTF-8 was added. One of your problems with UTF-8 is the fact that it favors character sets based on the Latin alphabet, and Japanese titles may, for example, take quite a lot of space to encode. So there are quite a couple of writers of MP3 files, that in Japan will use Shift-JIS to write Japanese characters into these MP3 files. It's not standardized, and it will be displayed as garbage if you were to play it on a normal player that is compliant. The tags were initially 2-letter tags, but later on they were extended to 3-letter tags, and they were mandated to start with the letter T. So the title that you saw on the previous screen, TIT2, meets that requirement. The composer would be TCOM for composer, and so on. The number of frames, or frame types really, were around 74 for Id3 version 2.3. They are about 83 for Id3 version 2.4. But more than that, applications can also define their own frame types. So this becomes a really big question. If you have so many frame types available, which do you include? Which do you omit? Which additional ones do you define? And every generator is likely to think about this differently. Obviously, it's the author of the generator who will think about it, but that software that produces the MP3 file will be designed to select only a subset of all of these tags, and that may enable us to identify the tool that created the MP3 file. In 2005, provision was also made to add chapters to either Id3 version 2.3 or Id3 version 2.4. This is ideal for some slightly more advanced applications such as podcasts that can be divided into chapters. It has not seen significant uptake. It has not seen significant use. In fact, Id3 version 2.4 is not common, and one doesn't encounter that too often. Let us make this practical. I have a couple of songs lined up here, and there are the 3 songs that we're going to look at. And the way in which we can look at these songs would typically be to use a hex dump or something like that. Problem with hex dump is on the screen, especially if you're watching this on a small screen, is that it is so cluttered that one can hardly read what is displayed. However, what I can do is to cat it, and initially I'm going to say cat it, but use the -v option or the -v option, which means the non-printing characters will be displayed with the up arrow or the M notation. And the very first song that we want to look at is that particular one. It's a pretty long song. Any MP3 file is pretty long, so not a particularly long song this, but we might as well pipe it through less so that we have less to deal with. And you can see that it starts off with the letters Id3, so the file marker, the file signature, the magic number is Id3 for this type of file. You can see the tags that we've been talking about. So here we expect the title of the song. Remember that this is followed by some encoding information that tells you how the string is to be read, whether it's plain Latin or whether it is UCS2 or whether it is some other encoding. If we look a little bit further, you can see there is the title. It's a bit hard to read with all these control characters intervening, but those were the days and what follows that. TPE is used to indicate the performer. TPE1 used to indicate the primary performer. Again, some encoding information, but going forward we can see that this is Mary Hopkin. TPE2 may be the co-performer, it may be the album artist, and in this case, if we go forward, it is again Mary Hopkin. There's the name of the album, so album is like named, those were the days and so on. We have the year going right up to that point, and if we look at the end there, we can see 2014, There's information about the track, the position, even the copyright, and if we go down far enough, then you can see that there is the associated picture, the graphic that is embedded in this. And as we've said, there may be multiple graphics, the front cover, the back cover, the picture of the artist, and so on. Just going through with this tag, you can see the Jpeg information that follows, and we expect quite a lot of binary information to follow this. Clearly, we are dealing with Id3 version 2. From the character encoding, it does not look like Latin 1. It does not look like UTF-8, does not look like UTF-16, so we have to conclude that this is probably UCS2. Question is whether there can be other information, Id3 version 1 information. So just look at the bottom of this file. And looking at the bottom of this file, we do not see anything readable. Now, what I've not said thus far is that this is a file that I bought from Google when Google still had a music store. So to some extent, this represents the way that Google Music Store music looks. I'll have to do a thorough empirical study to conclusively say that. But over the years, this is the typical pattern that I've observed. So I'm not making the claim based on this one single file, but also I have not looked at these files in detail. It's a bit hard to read using the notation that we've been using, so we may be able to use a little trick to look at it better. As I've noted, it would have been better to use a Xmp utility or something, but that presents problems to read it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say cat this file just as it is, binary data and all, and then I'm just going to delete all the non-printing characters. Easier way to specify which characters should be deleted is to say complement, and then I tell it which should be kept. So I want the alphanumerics to be kept, and I probably want the space to be kept, and a full stop may be useful. We'll see whether we need to add anything else to that. And then yet again, this will still be a lot of information, so I'm going to pass this through less, and now it becomes a bit easier to read with all the non-printing characters removed. We have the Id3 tag. There is the title, specifically there is the title, and you can see the title is now quite readable. There is TPE1, the performer, and there is TPE2, album artist, if that's the way that it is interpreted. It is not prescribed how TPE1 and TPE2 and so on should be interpreted. It can be a contributing artist, for example. There is the album, there is the year, there is the track and some position and other information. There is the copyright notice, and there is the associated picture, and that follows this obviously just the things, the binary data, the bytes that happen to match printing characters that are displayed, so pretty useless. If we do exactly the same, but I just want to look at the tail again to double check that there is no Id3 version 1 information, then we can see that even though we've cut it down to readable values only now, there's nothing there that is readable. That's just the command prompt that started immediately after the file. Now, to do the same with the next song, I'm going to yet again say cat it just the way it is. File to be cat is that particular song. That is a song that I bought from the Amazon Music Store. I am going to yet again do what I did previously, so I'm going to delete and I'm going to complement what I specified, so what I want to see rather than what I want to have deleted are the alphanumerics. I want spaces, I want full stops. I've also noticed while looking at this previously that this includes XML, so I am also going to ask for that to be displayed, and then I am going to look at the top of this file. Rather, we can just look at this file using less. We can see that it also starts with Id3, so magic number is the same. Then we have a tag that does not look like an Id3 tag, because Id3 tags, especially the later Id3 version 2 tags, have to start with the letter T. So this is other information, and you can indeed see that this is coming from Amazon.com, and then there's a whole long XML description and interesting information that we can scan through. But what I am looking for in particular are Id3 information. Let us look at the next screen full of information, And there we are indeed beginning to see Id3 version 2 tags. There you can see the title is Barcelona, and then the performing artist number 1 is Alfie Bowie. Then the album itself, album there is Home Sweet Home Deluxe. The content is classical. Other information that we can look at, but there is the performing artist number 3, David Temple. Track information. The year is 2015. Performing artist number 2 is Catherine Jenkins. And there is a comment, and you can see that Amazon song number whatever has been included as the comment. There is the copyright notice 2014, Decca, and so on. And we can go further with this and explore it in detail to see exactly what has been included. I want to do the same with this particular one, but this time I want to look at the tail so that we can see whether any Id3 version 1 information has been included. And there we do see the Id3 version 1 information. There's the tag, and then the title would have been 30 characters long, obviously due to the fact that I've deleted the non-printing characters. We don't get the full 30 characters. The next 30 characters would be the artist, and that is Alfie Bowie. The album would be the next 30 titles, Home Sweet Home Deluxe. Then we will have the year, and then we have a comment field, and that's the Amazon.com song title. And my name that you see there is just the start of the next prompt. So here we have a song purchased from Amazon, and it has Id3 version 1 information at the bottom. Just looking up a little bit, we do not see that tag plus or ext included here anywhere. We only see the original tag. Whether this comment is modified to include the track number, we can easily count the characters to see whether we're using all 30. It doesn't quite look like that. So it's possible that the track number is encoded there. So I don't know whether this is Id3 version 1 or Id3 version 1.1. To illustrate that this is not an accident, I'm going to cat the next file, which is also one that was bought from Amazon. And in this particular case, I'm going to yet again translate, and I'm going to delete, and yet again deleting the non-printing characters so that we can only see the printing characters. And I again want to look at the top of this file, so piping it through less. Here you can see that we do not have all the XML that we've just seen, even though this was also purchased from Amazon. We can see that it starts with an Id3 tag. We can see the title 2, Die Kunst der Fuge, and then the art of the fugue, and then all the other information that you very often find in classical compositions. So a pretty long title that doesn't fit into an Id3 version 1 tag. Then the performer is the Basel Brass Quintet. The album, it is 111 amazing classical Bach. So one of those compilations. The content is classical. The composer is Johann Sebastian Bach. Then a rather interesting track entry that we're getting there. We will see that unpacked in a moment or two. You can see the year is 2013. This raises the question, this is a little bit earlier than the other album that we looked at from Amazon. Question is whether the XML was introduced later or whether the XML occurs in some music files but not in others. In this case, the album artist is various artists. We again have an associated image, an APIC, and what follows would then be the picture that is included. That can yet again be one or more pictures depicting various aspects of this particular album. Also want to look at the tail. Now, I keep on saying I want to look at the tail. The fact that I've stripped out all the new lines means this is one long line, so I am not really getting the tail, I'm getting the entire file. That's why it scrolls past the screen so quickly. But yet again, as we saw in the previous Amazon file, we do see the tag, and then the title is Die Kunst der Fuge, the art of. And there you see that we've run out of space. We don't have enough space to fit the entire title in, so that's only the first 30 characters. Looking up, there is no EXT or no tag plus, so clearly nothing that extends the title here. Then the next entry would be the performer. That's the Basel Brass Quintet. Then it would be the album title, 111 Amazing Classical Bach, and then the year 2013, and then the comment field, Amazon.com, song ID, and we see the song ID listed there. So all of this more or less consistent, at least in terms of Id3 tags for the two Amazon files that we looked at. I have not looked at another Google music file, but the Google music files that I have looked at are all similar to the one that I showed you. To interpret this, we need empirical research, and then maybe, just maybe, we can identify the store from which an MP3 file was purchased if it had not been edited. At the very least, in these Amazon songs, you can see the information that is repeated in two Id3 tags, and it is pretty easy to get those two out of sync so that they do not contain the same information, and that would be an indication of tampering. We could also have looked at music that had been ripped from a CD. The information would obviously depend on the ripping tool, but we've spent enough time looking at the bits and bytes in these MP3 files. Let's move on to a higher level tool. I am going to use Mp3 Tag here. I know it will be hard to read the specific details, but the three songs that we've just looked at, or the three pieces of music that we've looked at, are displayed in the main window here. If I were to click on any one of them, then the details that is available would be filled in. So here we have the album art for the Mary Hopkin song, Those Were the Days. There's the title, there's Mary Hopkin, and there's the album title, the year, and interestingly, the track is one of two. In older music, you will often only get the track number as a 1 or a 2 or a 3. Here it tells us where it fits into this bigger picture. Interesting, aspect that also needs our attention, though it may be hard to read, is that the tool tells us that Id3 version 2.3 was used and that the only available information in the file is Id3 version 2.3. Now, if we were to move on to the second song, the Barcelona song, then you can see the album art, you can see the Amazon song ID that now populates the comment field, and perhaps more importantly is that the Mp3 tag that was used was again Id3 version 2.3, but it notes that Id3 version 1 is available. It doesn't say that this is specific Id3 version 1 or 1.1, but it notes that that is available, and it also notes that Id3 version 2.3 is available. With the third song, we get the same distinction here, that Id3 version 2.3 was used, but it notes that in addition to that, Id3 version 1 is available. We noted the track number when we were going through the file contents, and there you can see the reason why. This is number 47 of 111. If we go to the settings of this particular tool, then you can see the tags that are listed as options, and it tells you that it can read Id3 version 1, Id3 version 2 without any specific information about Id3 version 1 or 2, the subversions. However, when it writes files, it does want to know whether it will write the file details in UTF-8, UTF-16, Latin character set, and for Id3 version 2, it asks the question whether it should insert Id3 2 only if it can't fit all the required details into the Id3 version 1 fields, if the fields are too small. While we're talking about tag types, just going to look at the other tags that can be handled by this, and there's also ape, and then mapping from some other standards. For example, in some standards, date will be mapped to year, organization will be mapped to publisher, and so on, and then a couple of advanced options that are not particularly interesting for our purposes right now. Something else worth looking at is the tag panel. So those are the tags that are generally supported by this tool or with which it comes pre-configured. However, I can also add a field, and the fields that can be added is a rather long list of tags. Not necessarily all of them recognized Id3 tags, but as we've said previously, an application can also add its own tags if it wants to. Let us quickly look at another album just to get a feeling for some other inferences that we may make from Id3 tags. This is an album by Montserrat Caballé, and the interesting thing to note here is while the Id3 information is correct, if one were to look at the file name, I'm not sure how visible that will be on the recording, but that file name has been totally corrupted. So somewhere, because of all the special characters in the title of that song, if you were to look at the title, then you will see that there are things like España with the tilde above the N. However, the file name encodes it entirely differently, which suggests to me that this was stored on a file system at some point, perhaps a FAT file system, that couldn't cope with the encoding and change the file name to something that it could represent. So yet another indication that something unusual may have happened. Now, obviously, I've changed the Id3 information on most of my music library, updated it and so on. And it is quite possible that at some point I stored this on a fat file system and that I'm responsible for that name that appears in such a funny way. Easy enough to correct now, but I will do it one day rather than take you through the exercise. It seems Id3 has merit. From our examination of Id3 entries in these files that we examined, we could make quite a couple of inferences about the file that we were dealing with. More than that, we can substantiate our findings about that file, at least in principle. Yet again, we need more empirical data so that we are sure that what we are observing in this case, in a couple of instances, do apply to a broad spectrum of files that use Id3 data types. And remember again that Id3 is a data structure that is used in more than one file, just like Exif, in principle, is a structure that is used in more than one file type. Therefore, once we can make a claim about Id3 or about the Id3 structure, that claim in principle applies to the other file types that use that same structure to describe its contents as well. And similarly with Exif, we can use claims, lessons that we've learned in one context to another file type. Not without the research though. Research will always be necessary to back up these claims that we are making. Let us now move on to a third example. And in this third example, I'm going to use a file type that does not use such a data structure that is shared by other file types. It's unique to this file type. And the file type that I'm looking at here is an email. It may sound a bit strange when I talk about an email as a file type or as a file, but obviously that message that is conveyed is ultimately stored in a file, typically stored at the origin and also stored at the destination. That file, that message, consists, like so many other data streams, of a header and a payload. And here we're particularly interested in the header because it is typically the header that contains the metadata of that email message. And the header typically names the program that was used to create this email, the email client or the mail user agent. It contains information about the time that this email was sent. Yes, very often it is the time on the local machine from which the email was sent. It contains information about the intended recipient of the email. It contains information about the format in which the email is presented, and so on. Keep in mind, just as an aside, that I can in the header say that this email is going to someone, but during the SMTP network communications, I can actually send it to someone else, so that this email may arrive at the wrong person. So there are two fields that indicate to, and the one is recorded in the message, it's part of that file, and the other one is just part of the transaction. Typically there is no record apart from possibly in the logs about that message. So what we are looking at the moment is looking at this document. It is questioned for whatever reason. We want to examine it, and now we are asking questions about the metadata. The metadata, yet again, depends on the email program that creates it. So the given client will insert certain entries into that header, while another one may omit it. A certain client may insert those entries in a particular way, while another client may use another way. The sequence of entries may differ from one client to another client, and so on. As a matter of fact, one of the things to keep your eyes open for is some email clients will never use a specific heading, while another email program may use that heading. And if we see this heading in an email program that would never have used it, then again, it's a giveaway that something has gone wrong in that header that describes the file. When I talk about metadata in an email context, the usual assumption is that I'm talking about the headers that have been added by the mail transfer agents as the mail was relayed from one hop to the next hop to the next hop to the destination. A lot of research has been done on this already, where you look at the path that this email travels. And unfortunately, it seems that it doesn't really work. It sounds like such a good idea to trace the origin of email using these relays that record the headers, but I have some bad news there. It doesn't mean we can we should totally discard that information. There is still some value in that, but not nearly the amount of value that we had previously hoped to get from that forwarding information. However, what we can claim is that at the receiving end, the metadata about the email has been enriched. Another couple of header pieces have been added by each of these mail transfer agents or each of these relays. And whether that is useful in terms of tracing the origin of the email, in terms of who sent it, it may still be useful when one looks at that email to make some statements about its correctness, avoiding the word authenticity again, but whether it is consistent with what we would expect such an email to look like. For example, these mail transfer agents, when they add their headings, they tend to use very different specifications. Some will just use domain names. Others will also include IP addresses. Some will only use IP addresses. Some will say whom they received the mail from. Some will only say whom the email is intended for. And it is precisely this inconsistency in these headers that make it so hard to use the relay information, the forwarding information, to trace email back to its origin. That's why those experiments tend to not work as well as one hopes. But the fact that a certain mail transfer agent uses a certain format is something that we can look at, and we can compare what we got with what we expected. Now, this takes our notion of keeping a database perhaps a little bit too far, because as the mail transfer agents are replaced over time, they may change the format in which they add headers. In fact, just changing the configuration file of one of those mail transfer agents may also change the header that they prepend to the message. So better option here would be to look at what one finds, then try to find other examples of emails that have been sent during the same time period that were handled by that mail transfer agent, and then start this comparison. I think it's too much to ask to keep a record, changing record of exactly what mail transfer agents do. In principle, all mail transfer agents in the world, that database is just going to be too big. So here is one of those cases where I would say that information is readily available, because active email transfer agents will be used by multiple programs, and it should not be too hard to find other examples of where that transfer agent was involved. Bottom line is my claim that we can now, at the receiving end, compare the mail transfer agent syntax, the way in which they included their message, with what was expected, and then we can begin to make a claim about whether that meets our expectations. So on the one hand, we can make claims about the consistency of the email that was sent by looking at the expected headers of the sender, and on the receiving end, we may make claims also about the sender email client, but we may also make sense about the consistency of the headers that were prepended by the mail transfer agents compared to what we expected. And that tells us something about the place where an email may have been changed if we suspect that it has in fact been changed. In our previous video, we looked at metadata in PDF files rather extensively. However, let's look at that again just as a refresher to remind us what it looked like and what we can learn from it. Just to recap, during our previous video, we looked at a file that we called helloworld.pdf. When you display it, it simply says hello world. This time we've got a copy of that file and it's called old.pdf because it's now the old one. We have a new hello world, and in it we found information, amongst others, about the creator, and there it is, the producer, the creator, creation date, the modification date, and so on. Searching further, that was the only place where we found that. For this video, I copied hello world and then I used LaTeX to convert it to a PostScript file. So just in case you haven't seen a PostScript file yet, we can look at the hello world.PostScript file. That's what it looks like. You can see that it has what looks like metadata in the header. And when you go down, this is a programming language that creates output on a printer. I've used PS to PDF to convert that file to PDF, and yet again we have our PDF file. This time it's PDF 1-4, and yet again I can search for create, and suddenly we see XML style create information. That's something that we also saw in the utilities bill last time, if you recall. Going on, I do have something that looks pretty much like what we had previously. Difference is this time is that the creator is DVIPS, and it was produced by Mp3 Ghost Script. What this means is we are yet again in the position where we have two creation dates and in principle two creators, because there's the creator as DVIPS, and then here is the creation date copied, but there's a creator tool now, which is DVIPS. And this yet again leaves the opportunity for inconsistencies to exist when I were to modify this file. I can use PDFTK to modify it, and I can see what I get out of it, look at the differences. However, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to reuse Exif Tool. Remember, Exif Tool is really intended for use on Exif data. This is not Exif data, but Exif Tool is indeed capable of reading a whole bunch of file types. If we were to look at hello world.PostScript to start out with, and we were to pipe that through less, then we will see that we get the information about the PostScript file. I don't want to spend too much time looking at this because we're not going to really discuss it, but I can also use this to extract the data about the PDF file. If I were to go down, then we have a creator tool that is listed here, and there is a creator that is listed there. Two happen to be the same. It just shows you the duplication that exists and the sort of thing that we can check for consistency. Question here is whether the modification date is taken from the XML data or taken from the other object. In fact, let's quickly just go and look at that file again. So I'm going to open hello-world.pdf, which is now the one that was created with the new approach, taking the tag to DVI and then the DVI to PDF. And if we were to search for that creator tool, then here is the XML portion of it. And one of the things that you can see here is that this is in object 11, which is of type metadata. If we search for creator tool a little bit further down, then this is still in the XML, lots of create data, but there we get the creator in this case, or the producer then, and there's the creator, and this is in object 2. It doesn't tell us what type of object this is, not immediately anyway. So let's just search for where that object is linked. Where does it fit into the tree? And here you can see that it is linked as an info tree. So we have an info node that contains information, but we also have a metadata object. The other instance where we saw the metadata was object 11, so let's quickly go to 11. And there you do see the creator information. If we look at the pointer to it, the pointer to it is 11.0R. And you can see that it is indeed described as metadata. One of the interesting things that we should point out in this hello-world.pdf is the following. If we run Exif Tool on it and we look at hello-world.pdf, pipe it via less, then you will see that there's an Xmp Toolkit listed. Xmp Toolkit is an Adobe product. It's the extensible metadata platform. And that is a toolkit that you can use to create metadata. That is responsible for the creation of the XML metadata. So what it means is we can also link the format of our metadata to this toolkit. And if we know that a certain application uses this toolkit, again, we need to consider things like version numbers and so on. But if we are familiar with what to expect from this toolkit, we may know what to expect from any application that uses the toolkit. So we do not have to look at each and every piece of software. We can look at the metadata or toolkit, and that may tell us what to expect. And then if we have a tool such as this that produces metadata twice, then we have something to compare for the sake of consistency. Thus far in this video, we've considered Exif, we've considered Id3, we've considered email, we've considered PDF, and as our final example, I want to make a couple of remarks about video metadata. In the case of video, there are a couple of interesting facets that we can consider, and the facet that I am most interested in right now is the use of encoders and decoders, because the encoders and the decoders have a profound impact on the way in which the data itself is structured. And before we even begin to analyze the data, before we even begin to look at the internal structure of a document, of this video document, we can look at the codecs that were used, and from those codecs and their settings, we may be able to learn quite a bit about the origin of that particular video that we are looking at. In order to talk about video metadata, Let's talk about the information that one can get from VLC. It's arguably not the best tool to get metadata, but it will serve its purpose. What you are seeing on the screen is something that ended up on the blooper roll while I was recording this particular video. There was a motorbike that drove past while I was busy talking, and I had to cancel that particular recording because I thought the music from the motorbike would be far too hard. Should see the motor drive passing past and angrily reacting to that. But that's not the point there. The point is that I want to look at the metadata, and the metadata is on the Control I key here. On the first screen, you will see that I have typical information that is provided for any sort of album, sort of thing that we saw with Id3, so title, artist, album, genre, and so on. Then there's a tab that is called Metadata. Arguably hard to see for you, but it does identify the duration, and it does identify the specific encoder that was in use here. There is information about the codecs that were used. Again, arguably too hard for you to read, but an H.264 encoder, Mp3 ABC with its details, type of video recording at 1920 by 1080. For some reason, the frame rate is 60 frames per second. I thought it was set to 50. And one audio stream, which is Jpeg audio MP4A, and recorded at 44,100 Hertz, 32 bits per sample, more or less stereo quality CD recording that's going on here. What this metadata does not tell you is that you are looking at the Matroshka file. So the container file is a Matroshka file, but that's easy enough to obtain with more fully fledged video metadata providers. Point that I wanted to make here is just that some of that data is easily obtainable. This is minimal that you're seeing here. You really need a better tool, but we do not want to spend a lot of time talking about it because this video is already extremely long. It is time to begin to summarize what we've observed during our experiments. First of all, the metadata often suggests to us which tool modified or created the document. And the moment that we have that information available, we have certain expectations about the composition of the document, the internal composition in terms of its macroscopic and microscopic aspects. Given the creator, we also have certain expectations about the structure of the metadata itself. In particular, if multiple tags are allowed, which tags are used by that creator, which tags are not used by that creator, and we can form a picture of whether the metadata itself is consistent with that creator. Thirdly, the syntax of the metadata may depend on the creator. Often there is some variety in the manner in which metadata can be presented, and if it is a rather open specification, the metadata that is encountered should be aligned with what is expected for such metadata from such a creator. Next, we expect consistency. Internal consistency, if the same data or related data is recorded in multiple fields in the metadata structure, then those fields should be in agreement. Any contradictions there is reason for concern. We should also look at external consistency. If the system is somehow connected to another digital system, such as a GPS satellite, then that may still be within our expertise and we may be able to say something about it. If the system is connected to some physical devices, then we are leaving the digital world behind. We are entering the physical realm, and in most cases, we will have to defer to the knowledge of someone who knows more about the physical world, except when we can see that it is a minor digital mistake that has been recorded. Given all these possible consistencies and inconsistencies and other expectations that have to be met, means that we have potentially a fairly large set of tests to perform. Once we performed all of those tests and we have not found any reason to doubt the document that has been presented to us, we can begin to find some support that the document may indeed be in the form in which it was created. We may be able, more specifically, to answer the questions that have been raised about the document. However, we will not rest with these tests because there are many other aspects of documents that also allow us to test them to answer specific questions raised about the document. And those will be covered in the videos that are to follow. Hopefully at the end of the series, we will have a set of tests that give us a solid basis to answer questions that are asked in a forensic context about digital documents.